My wife passed away, leaving $5 million to our son and debt for me. When I asked my son for help, his wife blocked me. A man in bankruptcy cannot be part of a millionaire family. Desperate, I called the son of my wife's former partner, the boy whose college tuition I had paid. No one knew he had become a millionaire Wall Street lawyer. When the 18 black limousines pulled up in front of the house, he said only one sentence. "Before I start, let me know in the comments where you are watching my story from, so I can know how far it reached. My name is Robert G. Morales. I am 65 years old, and I spent my entire life working with my hands. I was born in a humble neighborhood in Chicago, one of those where kids play street hockey, and the women greet each other from their windows. My father was a bricklayer, and my mother sold sandwiches on the corner of our house. Since I was a kid, I learned that in this life, nobody gives you anything for free, that everything is achieved with effort and dedication. At 18, I met Helen at a neighborhood party. She was the prettiest girl I had ever seen, with those honey-colored eyes and that smile that lit up any room. It was hard for me to win her over because I had nothing more to offer her than my desire to get ahead. But she liked something about me. Or maybe she saw that I was a man of my word. We got married 2 years later in a simple ceremony at St. Michael's Church, with a band we paid for with contributions from all our friends and a party in her parents' backyard. The early times were tough, but we were happy with little. Helen and I rented a small apartment in Queens with 2 bedrooms and a little kitchen where there was barely room for the 2 of us. I worked in construction with a friend of my dad's, hauling sacks of cement and learning the trade from the bottom up. Helen worked as a secretary in a government office. She earned little, but it was a steady income that helped us pay the rent and the groceries. 1 year after we were married, Andrew, our only son, was born. I perfectly remember that day at the General Hospital, when the nurse handed him to me wrapped in a light blue blanket, and I felt like my heart was going to leap out of my chest. I promised him right there, even though he couldn't understand me, that he would never lack anything, that I would work double or triple so that he would have a better life than mine. And I kept that promise, or at least I thought I did for many years. When Andrew was 5 years old, my partner Louis and I decided to venture out and start our own construction business. Louis was a smart guy, always with new ideas, and I was good with my hands and with dealing with people. We pooled our savings, which wasn't much, and started doing small jobs, fixing houses, painting facades, laying floors. Helen quit her job to help us with the administrative part. She kept the accounts in an old notebook and answered the phone we installed at home. The first few years were crazy. We worked Monday through Sunday, from sunup until sundown. Andrew grew up seeing his dad come home covered in cement and his mum surrounded by paperwork. On weekends, when he was 8 or 9, we would take him to the job sites so he could help us with simple things, so he could see what it cost to earn a living. He would complain sometimes, saying his friends went off to play while he had to be there with us. But I would explain to him that was life, that working as a family was what would get us ahead. Things slowly began to improve. We got bigger contracts, building entire houses, remodeling commercial buildings. By the time Andrew started junior high, we already had 5 full-time employees and a pickup truck with the company name painted on the sides. Helen and I felt proud to see how that dream we started at the kitchen table was becoming something real. But to truly grow, we needed capital, so we made the most risky decision of our lives. We mortgaged the house we had bought years before, a modest little house in the Valley Glen neighborhood that was our greatest pride. The bank lent us a good amount, and with that, we bought machinery, hired more people, and started bidding on government projects. Those were years of great stress. I barely slept, thinking that if something went wrong, we would lose everything. But Helen always told me we had to take risks, that it was the only way to give Andrew a better future. and the business grew. In 5 years, we went from being a small company to a mid-sized construction firm with important contracts. Andrew was in high school by then. He was a smart kid, though a bit lazy. He always preferred being with his friends over helping us with the company. Helen defended him, saying he was young and had the right to enjoy his youth, that we had already worked enough for him. I wasn't so sure. I worried that he didn't appreciate the effort, but in the end, I always gave in because she had a way of convincing me with a look. Louis, my partner, also had a son. His name was David. That boy was the complete opposite of Andrew. Studious, hard-working, always asking how everything in the company worked. Since he was a child, you could tell he was hungry to learn. Louis and I used to joke that David was born with overalls and a hard hat, while Andrew seemed to have been born with a suit. We loved them both as if they were our own sons, because that's how Louis and I were. More than partners, we were brothers. When David finished high school, he wanted to study law, but his family couldn't afford a private college, and he hadn't secured a spot at the University of Texas. Louis was worried. He didn't want his son to miss out on an education. One night, after closing a large contract, I told Louis not to worry, that the two of us would pay for David's college. Helen agreed. She said that boy deserved it for all the effort he put in. So David enrolled at a good private university, and we paid his tuition for all 5 years of the degree. He never forgot it. He always told us he would pay us back with work once he graduated, that he would be the best lawyer for the company. But life takes many turns. When David graduated, he got an incredible offer to work at an international law firm in New York City. Louis and I told him to go, not to pass up that opportunity just to stay with us. He left with the promise of returning someday, and although we wrote to each other occasionally, the years passed, and each of us followed our own path. Andrew studied business administration. He graduated without much trouble, though not with honours either. When he finished college, we brought him into the construction company to work with us. Louis and I were already thinking about eventually retiring. We wanted the next generation to take over the business. Andrew quickly learned the numbers and contracts side of things, though he never liked getting his hands dirty at the job sites like I did. He preferred to be in the office, in meetings with clients, managing the accounts. Helen said that was good, that times had changed and that now business was handled from a desk, not from a construction site. I wasn't completely convinced, but I couldn't complain either. The company kept growing, and Andrew seemed to have a good eye for business. It was at one of those client meetings that Andrew met Paula. She worked for a public relations firm that helped us secure government contracts. The first time I saw her, I didn't like her. I don't know why. She was a beautiful woman, well-dressed, one of those who speaks eloquently and knows exactly what to say at every moment. But there was something in her eyes, a coldness that I didn't like. Helen welcomed her, saying she was polite and came from a good family. Paula was from Beverly Hills. Her father was also a businessman, one of those people who is visibly wealthy from a mile away. Andrew was fascinated with her from day one. Within 6 months, they were engaged, and a year later, they married in a huge wedding in a Santa Barbara garden that cost a fortune. Helen was happy to see her son married. I tried to be too, although that strange feeling never left me. After the wedding, things started to change in the family. Paula convinced Andrew that they needed a house in a better area, that the neighborhood where we lived was no longer appropriate for their status. They moved to a mansion in Bel Air, a huge house with a pool and a garden that I never could have afforded even in my best years. Andrew started to change too. He became more distant, always busy with social commitments, dinners with investors, business trips. Helen justified everything by saying that was modern business, that we had to adapt. But I watched as my son drifted away, as Paula molded him into her image. Visits to our house became less and less frequent. When they did come, Paula would subtly complain about everything, that the house was too small, that the neighborhood was too ugly, that we didn't have this or that. Helen tried to please her, but I could see how much it hurt her. Then came the grandchildren, two beautiful boys born a year apart. Their names were Sam and Matthew. Helen was overjoyed. She wanted to see them all the time, but Paula always made excuses. The children had swimming lessons. They had a pediatrician appointment. They were too busy. When she finally let us see them, it was for short periods and always with her supervising, as if we had some contagious disease. I bit my tongue for Helen's sake, because I knew that if I complained, she would suffer more. My wife adored those children and would do anything to see them, even endure Paula's snubs. The business continued to do well for years. Louis and I grew old working, but we never regretted it. When I turned 60, I decided to start slowing down, leaving more responsibility to Andrew. Louis had died 2 years earlier from a heart attack. Losing my partner, my brother, left me devastated. His share of the company went to his family, but we eventually bought it so that everything would be in the Morales family's hands. Helen and I had a comfortable life. We weren't millionaires, but we didn't lack anything either. We had paid off the house and had money in the bank. The company was running smoothly. We planned on traveling, on enjoying our retirement years together after so much work. But life had other plans. 2 years ago, Helen started feeling unwell, tired with aches and pains that nothing would cure. At first, we thought it was just age, the normal wear and tear. But when she went to the doctor, they found advanced cancer. It felt as if the world was falling down around me. My Helen, the woman I had shared over 40 years with, the one who always had a smile, even in the most difficult times, was sick. The doctors said there were treatments, chemotherapy, options, but that it was complicated. A battle began that lasted almost 2 years, going in and out of hospitals. Treatments that cost a fortune, but which I paid without hesitations because she was my wife, the love of my life. Andrew would come to the hospital sometimes, but less and less often. He always had excuses. Too much work. The kids, commitments. Paula hardly ever showed up. She said hospitals gave her anxiety. Helen justified him, saying she understood that they were busy. But I saw the sadness in her eyes, that her son wasn't there when she needed him most. The medical expenses began to accumulate. The insurance covered some, but there were special medications, experimental treatments we had to pay for out of pocket. I started using the savings. Then I had to take money out of investment accounts. Helen begged me not to spend so much, that she was old and it wasn't worth it. But I couldn't stop trying. She was my wife. I was going to fight for her until the very last moment. During that time, Paula started showing up more often, but not to help with Helen, but to talk about practical matters. She said we needed to organize paperwork, that we needed to protect the assets, that with Helen's illness, we had to take legal precautions. I was so overwhelmed with my wife's condition that I barely paid her any attention. Paula brought a lawyer friend of hers, a slick guy who talked about wills, powers of attorney, asset reorganization. Helen signed papers. I signed papers. The lawyer said it was to protect us, so the medical expenses wouldn't eat up everything, and Andrew could inherit something. At the time, it seemed reasonable to me. I trusted my son, and that this was best for the family. Helen held on with dignity until the end. There were good days where it seemed she was getting better, where she recovered that light in her eyes and told me not to worry, that everything would be okay. But the bad days were more and more frequent. The last week she was in the hospital with so many medications that she could barely hold a coherent conversation. I didn't leave her side. I slept in a chair next to her bed, holding her hand. Andrew came on the last day when the doctors told us it was a matter of hours. Paula stayed in the waiting room. My Helen died on a Tuesday morning, her hand in mine, after whispering that she loved me and that I should take care of our grandsons. I felt my soul being ripped out when her hand went cold in mine. The funeral was simple, as she would have wanted. Many people from our old neighborhood came to say goodbye, lifelong friends, employees from the company. Paula organized everything efficiently, but without warmth, as if it were just another event on her calendar. After the burial, I was left alone in the apartment where we had lived the last few years. It was a rental in the Greenwich Village area that we had taken when we sold the Valley Glen house to pay for treatments. The loneliness was unbearable. Every corner held a memory of Helen, her coffee mug in the kitchen, her magazines on the living room table, her perfume that still floated in the air. I didn't want to be there, but I didn't know where to go either. A week after the funeral, Paula's lawyer came to read the will. Andrew was there, serious, distant. The lawyer read documents with legal jargon that I barely understood. What I did understand was the result. All the money, all the properties, the company, everything went into Andrew's name. I was left with practically nothing, only the pending medical debts. I was stunned. This couldn't be possible. Helen and I had always agreed that when one of us died, the other would be protected, and then everything would go to Andrew. I asked the lawyer if there wasn't a mistake. He showed me papers that Helen had supposedly signed, modifying her will. The papers had her signature, but I didn't remember being present when she signed them. The lawyer explained with that condescending voice that Helen had wanted to protect her son, that she considered I could take care of myself with my Social Security benefits. I felt betrayed, confused, but above all, devastated. Andrew wouldn't look me in the eye during the reading of the will. He stayed silent the entire time, playing with a pen between his fingers, as if he were in a regular business meeting and not deciding his father's future. When the meeting ended, I tried to talk to him, to ask for an explanation, to ask if his mother really would have wanted to leave me like this. But Paula intervened. She told me in that sweet but poisonous voice that it was best if I went to rest, that everything was still too raw, that we would talk calmly later. Andrew nodded without saying a word, and they left together. I stood there in the lawyer's office, feeling the floor opening beneath my feet. At that moment, I still didn't want to believe that my own son had done this to me. I looked for excuses in my head. I thought maybe there was some misunderstanding, that Helen, in her confusion from the medication, had signed something she didn't fully understand. The following days were a nightmare. The final hospital bills started arriving, funeral home accounts, overdue medication payments. They totaled dizzying amounts. My Social Security barely covered the apartment rent and basic food. There was no way I could pay those debts. I tried to contact Andrew several times. I called his cell phone, but he never answered. I sent him messages that were read, but with no reply. Once I went to the company offices, the company I had built with my own hands alongside Louis, and the new receptionist, a young woman who didn't know me, told me that Mr. Andrew was unavailable and that I needed to schedule an appointment. I explained that I was his father, but she looked at me with distrust, as if I were a lunatic or a scammer. I left there feeling humiliated, small, invisible. Mrs. Rose, my lifelong neighbour, came to visit me often. She was an elderly widow, one of those truly good people who are few in the world. She brought me food because she knew I barely cooked. She kept me company during the long afternoons, where the loneliness felt like a weight on my chest. One day I told her the whole story about the will while we were having coffee in my little living room. She remained silent for a moment, shaking her head disapprovingly, and then told me that it wasn't normal, that after so many years of marriage, I should have been protected. She told me that when she was widowed, she had inherited everything from her husband precisely to be secure in her old age, that that was what happened in real marriages. Her words made me think. Mrs. Rose was right. Something didn't add up. Helen never would have left me like that, unprotected with debts, depending on a miserable pension. She knew me. She knew I was too old to start over from scratch, that my health wasn't the best after so many years of heavy work. I started remembering those last few months in more detail. Paula's visits to the hospital with the lawyer, the quiet conversations they had with Helen when I went out to stretch my legs or get a coffee. Helen was heavily medicated during those days. Sometimes she didn't even recognize me. Other times she spoke of things that made no sense, confusing the past with the present. The doctors had explained to me that it was normal for the strong painkillers and the illness itself to affect her clarity. I remembered that on several occasions, Paula had put papers in front of Helen to sign, telling her they were hospital authorizations or company paperwork that urgently needed her signature. I trusted that my daughter-in-law was helping. It never occurred to me that she could be taking advantage of the situation. I also remembered that they had made me sign documents. Paula told me they were powers of attorney, so Andrew could handle medical expenses and company matters, while I was busy taking care of Helen. I signed without reading. I was emotionally devastated. The only thing that mattered to me was that my wife didn't suffer. One afternoon, Mrs. Rose asked me about David, Louis's son. I told her he had gone to New York City years ago, that he was a successful lawyer there. She told me I should call him, that maybe he could review the will papers, find something strange. At first, I resisted. I didn't want to bother David with my problems. Besides, I was embarrassed to admit that my own son had left me destitute. But the more I thought about it, the more sense it made. David owed me a lot. I had paid for his entire college education. I had treated him like a son. If anyone was going to help me without judging me, it was him. I started searching through the old boxes I had stored in the closet. Papers from years ago, photos, memories of better times. I found the album where Helen kept the photos from David's college graduation. There we were, Louis, Helen, David, and me, all smiling, proud. At the bottom of a box, I found a business card David had given me when he got the job in New York City. It had his phone number and email address. It took me 2 days to gather the courage to call him. I was afraid he wouldn't remember me, or worse, that he would remember but wouldn't care. One night, after tossing and turning about it, I dialed the number. It rang several times, and just as I was about to hang up, I heard his voice. David was surprised to hear from me. We hadn't spoken in years. I told him Helen had died. He was quiet for a moment, and then offered his condolences, his voice cracking. He told me she had been like a second mother to him. Then, with a broken voice, I told him the whole story. The will, the debts, how Andrew had turned his back on me, how I was about to lose the apartment. David listened without interrupting, and when I finished speaking, there was a long silence on the other end of the line. I thought maybe he regretted answering, that he would politely say goodbye, and I would never hear from him again. But then he said something that gave me a little hope. He told me that what I was telling him didn't sound legal, that no will in Mexico left the surviving spouse completely unprotected, and that there had to be irregularities. David asked me not to sign anything else. No documents, no agreements with banks or creditors. He told me he would investigate from New York City, that he had contacts in Mexico who could help him review official documents. He asked if I had copies of the will papers. I told him yes. The lawyer had left me some copies that I hadn't even read completely because I didn't understand the legal language. David asked me to scan them and send them to him via email. I didn't know how to use those things, but Mrs. Rose helped me. We went to an internet cafe in the neighborhood, and she asked the boy working there to help us. We sent the documents that same afternoon. David also asked me how much I needed to survive while he investigated. I told him that enough for the apartment rent and a little for food and medicine was enough, that I didn't want to take advantage. He insisted, telling me that he owed everything to me and his father, that if it weren't for us, he would be working any old job instead of being a lawyer at an international firm. The next day, I received a bank transfer that left me speechless. It was enough to pay 3 months of rent and live comfortably while we waited. I cried when I saw the money in my account, not because of the amount, but because someone, even from so far away, had remembered me. 2 weeks passed during which I lived in constant anguish, waiting for news from David. I kept trying to contact Andrew without success. I felt like a ghost, as if I had ceased to exist for my own son. The collectors from the hospital and clinics called every day. Some threatened lawsuits, with seizing the little I had left. I told them to stay calm, that I was resolving the situation. But the truth was, I didn't know if David would find anything, or if I would simply have to accept that my life had ended at 65. Late one night, David called me. His voice sounded different, excited, angry. He told me he had found something big, that he needed me to fly to New York City to explain everything in person and plan what we were going to do. I told him I didn't have the money for such a trip. He interrupted me, saying not to worry, that he would send me the plane ticket and pick me up at the airport. I was going to take my first plane trip in years, my first trip without Helen, and I was doing it to fight for what was mine. The flight was strange, uncomfortable. I never liked flying, and doing it alone made it worse. I spent the hours looking out the window, thinking about everything that had happened, how my life had changed so much in so little time. When I arrived at the JFK airport in New York City, I felt completely lost. Everything was huge, full of people rushing everywhere, announcements in English that I didn't understand. David was waiting for me at the exit. He recognized me immediately, even though I had aged a lot since we last saw each other. We hugged. He squeezed me tightly, and I felt his voice break. He told me he was so sorry for everything that was happening, that we were going to fix it. Once in his car, driving through those streets full of towering buildings, he asked me how I was really doing. I told him the truth, that I felt finished, betrayed, old, and tired. He told me not to give up yet, that what he had discovered was going to change everything. We arrived at his apartment, a modern place in a high-rise building with a view of Manhattan. It was so different from my little apartment in the village that I felt out of place. David lived alone. He explained that he had gotten divorced a couple of years earlier, that work consumed all his time. That night, we had Chinese food that he ordered by phone, and we talked about general things. His father Louis, the old days at the construction company, Helen. It was comforting to talk to someone who had known my wife when we were young, when we still had dreams and energy. David told me he never forgot what we did for him, that he owed his professional success, in large part, to the opportunity we gave him to study. He said it was his turn to help me now, that was what family did. Take care of each other. The next morning, we went to his office. It was an impressive place. A full floor of a skyscraper overlooking Manhattan, young people working on huge computers, conference rooms with glass walls. David took me to his private office and closed the door. He pulled out a thick folder full of documents and asked me to sit down. What he explained to me over the next few hours left me cold. David had used his contacts in Mexico to thoroughly investigate the entire process of the will and the property transfers. He had discovered that Paula, with the help of the lawyer she had hired, had manipulated everything from the start. First, David explained, they had gotten Helen to sign a broad power of attorney when she was heavily medicated in the hospital. That power gave Paula authority to do practically anything with Helen's properties and accounts. Then they had done the same with me when I was emotionally distraught. They had made me sign papers that I believed were just to facilitate paperwork, but which actually stripped me of my rights over the family assets. David showed me copies of documents he had obtained from the public property registry. The Valley Glen house we had sold to pay for treatments hadn't actually been sold. It had been transferred to Andrew's name for a ridiculous amount, practically given away. The same went for other properties I didn't even know we owned. Small plots of land we had bought years ago as an investment, and that I had forgotten about because Helen handled those details. Everything had been transferred to Andrew's name using the powers of attorney, under the pretense of protecting the assets from taxes and medical expenses. David explained that this type of movement wasn't illegal if done with informed consent, but in our case, it was clear that neither Helen nor I were in a condition to give that consent. Helen, because she was under the effects of strong medications that affected her judgment, and me, because I was in a state of emotional shock due to my wife's illness. But the most important thing, David told me with eyes bright with indignation, was that he had found Helen's original will. He explained that in Mexico, wills are registered in a general archive, and he had requested an exhaustive search. He found 2 wills from Helen. The first one, made 10 years earlier, laid everything out fairly, most of the assets for me as her husband, a significant portion for Andrew, everything clear and transparent. That will had never been formally revoked. The second will, the one Paula's lawyer had shown us, dated from just 3 months before Helen's death, when she was already very sick. David showed me that second document and pointed out irregularities. Helen's signature looked shaky, different from her usual signature. There were no independent witnesses, only Paula's lawyer and a secretary who worked for him. And most suspiciously, David explained, that will left me with practically nothing, which went against all the conversations Helen and I had had during our marriage about protecting each other. David had also found something else, something that made my stomach churn. He had audio recordings legally obtained through a private investigator in Mexico. In those recordings, you could clearly hear Paula talking to the lawyer, planning how to clean up the assets so that everything would end up in Andrew's hands. In one of the conversations, Paula said verbatim that the old man, referring to me, couldn't see a single dollar because I was a nuisance, someone who didn't fit into the family she wanted to build. She said I was a reminder of Andrew's humble past, that as long as I was around, with my old clothes and my labourer's manners, Andrew would never be fully accepted in the social circles she moved in. The lawyer replied in the recordings that they had to be careful, that these things could go wrong if they weren't done properly, but Paula insisted. She said Helen was so ill that she would sign anything, and that I was so desperate that I wouldn't check anything carefully. Listening to those recordings was like being stabbed. It wasn't just Andrew's betrayal in allowing all this. It was hearing Paula's absolute contempt for me, how she saw me as trash that had to be thrown out of the house. I started crying right there in David's office, a cry of rage, of impotence, of humiliation. David let me vent. He put a hand on my shoulder and waited for me to calm down. Then he told me in a firm voice that we were going to fight this, that we had enough evidence to prove fraud, that we were going to get back what was mine, but he warned me that it wouldn't be easy, that this would probably destroy my relationship with Andrew forever. He said that when we came out fighting publicly, everyone would know, the neighbours, the friends, the people who worked at the company. He asked me if I was willing to go all the way. I didn't have to think about it much. I had nothing left to lose. My wife had died, My son had betrayed me. My dignity was in the gutter. I told David, yes, that I wanted to fight, that I wanted to get back what Helen and I had built with so much effort. But above all, I wanted the truth to be known, for people to know what kind of person Paula was, and for Andrew to see the consequences of letting himself be manipulated by her. David nodded and began to explain the plan. First, we would gather all the necessary documentation, get certified copies of the original will, of Helen's medical records, proving she was not in a condition to make decisions, and of the suspicious property movements. Then we would file a formal lawsuit with a judge in Mexico requesting the annulment of the second will and the revocation of all property transfers made under the fraudulent powers of attorney. And finally, when we had everything ready, we would confront Andrew and Paula directly. David had contacts in Mexico, lawyers from his own firm who could represent us there. We spent that entire week in New York City preparing the case. I felt useless, not understanding many of the legal things that were discussed. But David explained everything to me patiently. He told me that my role was important, that I was the key witness, the one who could testify about Helen's condition, about how Paula had manipulated the situation. He made me practice my statement over and over. He taught me to remain calm when they asked me difficult questions, not to let myself be provoked. We also talked about Andrew. David asked me if I thought my son knew everything Paula had done, or if he had been fooled too. I told him honestly I didn't know. I wanted to believe Andrew hadn't been fully aware of everything, that Paula had manipulated him too. But that image of him at his door when I came to ask for help, looking through the glass but not coming out to defend me, that image told me he did know, that he had chosen money and comfort over his own father. I returned to Mexico with a strange feeling, a mix of fear and determination. David would come 2 weeks later, when all the legal documents were ready and the lawsuit had been filed. In the meantime, I had to continue with my normal life, without raising suspicion. I shouldn't contact Andrew or let him know we were investigating. It was hard to keep the secret. Mrs. Rose noticed that something had changed in me, that I didn't look so defeated anymore. I told her part of what was happening. She was very happy. She told me that finally there would be justice. The collectors kept calling, but now, when they called, I told them with more confidence that everything would be resolved soon, to be patient. Some mocked me. They said that was what all debtors said. But I knew that this time was different. David was working day and night from New York City. He called me every 2 or 3 days to update me. He told me he had found more things, that the fraud network was bigger than we thought. Paula had not only manipulated Helen's will, she had also made moves with company accounts. She had diverted money into Andrew's personal accounts, using false invoices and inflated contracts. David explained to me that this was no longer just a problem with inheritance. It was tax fraud, money laundering, things that could land Paula and the accomplice lawyer in jail. He asked me if I wanted to go that far. I told him yes, that if they had broken the law, they had to pay the consequences, no matter who they were. Finally, the day arrived. David came to Mexico with a team of 3 more lawyers from his firm and a private investigator. They rented a suite in a downtown hotel and set up a kind of operations headquarters there. I went to meet with them. I felt important for the first time in months, like I was part of something again, like my opinion mattered. David introduced me to his team. Everyone treated me with respect. They called me Mr. Robert. They listened to me when I spoke. We reviewed the plan one more time. The next day we were going to formally file the lawsuit in the courts. That same day, while the court was processing the paperwork, we were going directly to Andrew and Paula's house to confront them. David wanted the confrontation to be public, for the neighbors to see, for it to be clear that we were not going secretly, but openly, with the law on our side. That night I barely slept. I thought about Helen. What would she say if she could see me now, preparing to confront our own son? I think she would be sad, but also proud. I knew she never would have wanted me to let myself be trampled, to accept the injustice without a fight. I also thought about Andrew, about the boy he had been, how I carried him on my shoulders when we went to the job sites, how he hugged me when I came home tired from work. That boy had disappeared, replaced by a man I no longer recognized. It hurt, but I knew I couldn't let the pain stop me. David was right. It was now or never. Either I fought for my dignity, or I gave up and let them trample me until the end of my days. The next morning dawned with a grey sky, threatening rain. David and his team arrived early to pick me up at the apartment. Mrs. Rose came out to see me off. She hugged me tightly and told me that God was with me, that the truth always comes out. We got into a caravan of 3 black SUVs. I was in the middle one with David. First, we went to the courthouse where one of the lawyers filed all the lawsuit documents. The process was quick, a matter of signatures and stamps. The judge, an older man with a serious look, briefly reviewed the documents and said that it would proceed, that the parties involved would be notified. David asked the judge to give us a document confirming that the lawsuit had been filed. The judge agreed and gave us an official paper with his signature. That paper was important because it showed that we weren't going to Andrew's house just to cause a scene. We were backed by judicial authority. From the courthouse, we headed to Bel Air, the neighborhood where Andrew and Paula lived. The journey felt eternal. My stomach was churning. My hands were sweating. David asked me if I was okay, if I wanted to continue. I told him yes, although the truth is I was terrified, not of Andrew or Paula, but of what this meant, the point of no return we were reaching. When we reached their street, the 3 black SUVs slowly advanced until they stopped in front of the mansion. It was mid-morning on a weekday. There were people on the street, gardeners working at neighboring houses, some women walking their dogs. Everyone turned to look at the caravan of vehicles. It was obvious that something important was happening. We got out of the SUVs, David first, then me, then the other lawyers and the investigator. Everyone was dressed formally, with briefcases in hand. We looked like an official entourage, and that was exactly the image we wanted to project. We walked towards the main door of the house. I was in the middle of the group, feeling protected, but also exposed. David rang the doorbell. An elegant melody was heard. A few seconds passed that felt like hours. Then the door opened, and there was Paula. She was wearing expensive athletic wear, her hair perfectly styled, impeccable makeup even at that hour of the morning. When she saw me, her expression changed from surprise to annoyance in a second. Before she could say anything, David introduced himself. He pulled out a business card and handed it to her. He told her in a clear, professional voice that he was the legal representative of Robert G. Morales, and that we had come to personally notify them about a lawsuit that had just been filed against her and her husband, Andrew Morales. Paula turned pale. She took the card with a trembling hand. From inside, Andrew's voice was heard asking who it was. Paula turned around, nervous, and then told us to wait, that we couldn't just come in like that. David calmly replied that we didn't need to come in, that we could do everything right there at the door, but that it was important for Andrew to be present to hear the accusations. Paula hesitated. She looked agitated. Finally, she said she would get him. A few seconds later, Andrew appeared. He was wearing sweatpants. It looked like he had just woken up or had been exercising. When he saw me, his face showed confusion, then something like guilt, and then he became serious, like when he did business. He looked me in the eye for the first time in months, and I held his gaze. I wasn't going to look away. Not this time. David began to speak. His voice was firm, but not aggressive. Professional. He explained to Andrew and Paula that he represented Robert Morales in a lawsuit for testamentary fraud, abuse of power of attorney, and illegal property transfers. He told them we had documented proof that they had manipulated Helen when she was under the effects of strong medication to make her sign a will that went against her true intentions. He showed them copies of the documents we had gathered. Helen's original will, the medical records, the suspicious property transfers. Andrew tried to interrupt several times, but David raised his hand and asked him to let him finish. He told him that we also had evidence of irregular financial movements in the company, that there were indications of tax fraud and money laundering. Paula exploded. She started yelling that everything was a lie, that I was a bitter old man who couldn't accept that his son had been successful, that everything they had was earned through work. David let her vent, and then, calmly, he took out a small audio player. He asked her if she wanted to hear something interesting. He pressed play, and from the speakers came Paula's voice, clear and unmistakable, saying that the old man couldn't see a single dollar, that he was a nuisance who didn't fit into her family. The accomplice lawyer was also heard talking about how to manipulate the documents. The silence that followed was absolute. Even the neighbors who had approached to peek remained silent. Paula was frozen, her mouth open, speechless for the first time since I had known her. Andrew looked at her with an expression I couldn't interpret. It could have been surprise, it could have been anger, it could have been shame. David continued, relentless. He told them that the lawsuit had already been filed, that they would receive the official notification from the court in the coming days, that we had enough evidence to win the case, and that we were asking for the complete annulment of the fraudulent will, the reversal of all property transfers, and compensation for moral and economic damages. He also informed them that we had sent copies of all the evidence to the tax authorities and the public prosecutor's office, and that they could face criminal charges. Paula tried to recover. She pointed her finger at me and screamed that I was an ingrate, that after all Andrew had done for me, I was coming to attack them, that I was a disgraceful father. Her voice was full of venom, of that contempt she had always felt toward me, but which was now coming out unfiltered. David was unfazed by Paula's attack. He simply replied in a calm voice that everything she was saying was being recorded, that there were witnesses present, and that her words only confirmed the contempt for her father-in-law that we already had documented in the previous recordings. He suggested she get a good lawyer, because she was going to need one. Paula realized she had put her foot in her mouth, that her emotional outburst had exposed her in front of everyone. She tried to backpedal, changed her tone, and told Andrew to go inside the house, that this needed to be resolved in private. But it was already too late. The damage was done. Neighbors were murmuring among themselves. Some were taking out their cell phones to record. The perfect image that Paula had so carefully maintained was crumbling before her eyes. Andrew finally spoke. His voice sounded tired, defeated. He asked me if this was true, if I really believed he had stolen from me. I looked him squarely in the eye and told him yes, that the evidence didn't lie, that he had allowed his wife to manipulate his dying mother to dispossess me of everything. I told him that what hurt the most wasn't the money or the properties, but that he had been there, watching me be humiliated, watching the door shut in my face when I came asking for help, and had done nothing. I reminded him of that day when Paula had treated me like trash at his door, and he had been on the other side of the glass, hearing everything, and had chosen not to come out and defend me. I asked him what his mother would have thought if she had seen that, if she had seen how he treated his own father. Andrew looked devastated. He tried to say something, but the words wouldn't come out. Paula pulled him by the arm. She told him not to say anything else, not to admit anything without a lawyer present. But Andrew shook her off roughly. It was the first time I had seen him physically contradict her. He stood there, looking at me, and I saw tears in his eyes. He told me he was sorry, that he didn't know things had gone so far, that Paula had told him everything was legal, that it was to protect the family assets. David intervened and told him that ignorance of the law was no excuse, and that if he really didn't know anything, then he had to cooperate with the investigation, hand over documents, and testify against Paula and the corrupt lawyer. He told him that was his only chance to save something of his relationship with his father and to avoid more serious criminal consequences. Paula erupted again, this time against Andrew. She screamed that he shouldn't be an idiot, that he shouldn't say anything, that I only wanted to ruin them to keep everything. She told him he was her husband, that he had to be on her side, that I was just an old man who couldn't accept that they had progressed more than I had. Andrew looked at her with an expression I had never seen on him, a mix of disgust and disappointment. He told her to shut up, that because of her he had lost his father, that because of her ambition he had betrayed his mother's memory. Paula fell silent, surprised by Andrew's tone. Then she tried to change her strategy. She approached him in a soft voice. She told him to think about their children, about the family they had built, about everything they had to lose. But Andrew moved away from her. He looked at me and said he needed time to process all this, that he was going to hire his own lawyer to review the documents, and that if everything was true, then he would do the right thing. David handed him a folder with copies of all the evidence we had. He told him to take all the time he needed, but that the legal process had already begun, that the judge had accepted the lawsuit, and that there would be hearings in the coming weeks. He also warned him that if he tried to move money, sell properties, or destroy evidence, it would only worsen his legal situation. Andrew grabbed the folder with trembling hands and nodded. We turned around to leave. I walked next to David, feeling strange. It wasn't the complete victory I had imagined, but it wasn't a defeat either. I had planted a seed of doubt in Andrew. For the first time in years, I had made him question Paula. As we were about to reach the SUVs, I heard Paula's voice yelling from the door. She cursed us. She said we were going to pay for this, that she had contacts, that we weren't going to win. David didn't even turn around. He just kept walking. I did turn around. I saw her standing there at the entrance of her mansion, red with rage, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was recovering some of my power, my dignity. Back at the hotel, David told me that things had gone better than expected. Paula's reaction, her implicit confession, the visible break between her and Andrew, everything played in our favor. He explained that now came the difficult part, the judicial process, which could take months. There would be hearings, depositions, expert testimony. I would have to testify, tell what had happened over and over. He asked me if I felt capable. I told him yes, that after what I had just done, confronting them in their own home, going to court would be easier. David smiled and told me I had done well, that I had remained calm and dignified, which was important. That night we had dinner at the hotel with the entire legal team. They toasted to me, to justice, to Helen. I felt accompanied, supported, something I hadn't felt since she died. The following days were a whirlwind of legal activity. David and his team worked non-stop, preparing documents, interviewing witnesses, coordinating with medical experts who could testify about Helen's mental state during her final months. I spent the afternoons at the hotel with them, listening to legal conversations that I sometimes understood and sometimes didn't. David was patient. He explained every step of the process to me. He told me we had achieved something important. The judge had ordered the freezing of all Andrew and Paula's bank accounts while the case was being resolved. That meant they couldn't move money, they couldn't sell properties, they were financially paralyzed. He also told me that the public prosecutor's office had opened a formal investigation against Paula and the corrupt lawyer for fraud. If they were found guilty, they could face several years in prison. One afternoon, I received a call from an unknown number. I hesitated to answer, but something made me do it. It was Andrew. His voice sounded broken, tired. He told me he had hired an independent lawyer to review all the documents David had given him. His lawyer had confirmed that the accusations were true, that there were serious irregularities in the entire process of the will and property transfers. He said he hadn't known anything, that Paula had told him everything was legal, that it was normal tax planning. I told him that did not excuse him, that he had seen how his wife treated me, how she humiliated me, and he had never done anything to stop her. There was a long silence. Then he told me I was right, that he had been a coward, that he had chosen comfort and money over his own father. He asked me if there was any way to fix this, if we could talk without lawyers involved. I told him it was too late for that the damage was done, that I couldn't simply forget months of suffering, of humiliation, of feeling abandoned. I told him that if he really wanted to do something good, then he should cooperate with justice, turn over all the documents he had, and testify against Paula and the corrupt lawyer. Andrew told me that would mean the end of his marriage. I replied that his marriage was built on lies and betrayal, that Paula had never loved him, only his money and social position. I suggested he think about his children, what kind of example he was setting for them if he protected someone who had committed fraud. Andrew started crying on the other end of the line. He told me he didn't know what to do, that his life was a mess. For a moment I felt sorry for him. He was my son, after all. But then I remembered those months of loneliness and pain, and the pity turned into something harder. I told him that everyone makes their own decisions and lives with the consequences, that I had already made mine by suing them, and that now he had to make his. I hung up the phone feeling emotionally exhausted. David, who had heard part of the conversation, asked me if I was okay. I told him what Andrew had said. David explained to me that this was good for our case, that if Andrew was willing to cooperate, we could strengthen the accusations against Paula. He asked me what I really wanted, justice or revenge. The question took me by surprise. I told him that at first, I just wanted to get back what was mine, to be able to live out my final years with dignity. But now, after discovering the depth of the betrayal, after hearing those recordings where Paula spoke of me as if I were trash, I wanted something more. I wanted them to pay for what they had done. I wanted the truth to come out. I wanted everyone to know what kind of people they were. The official court notification arrived at Andrew and Paula's house the following week. David told me that, according to his contact in Mexico, Paula had had an outburst when the process server handed her the documents. She had tried to slam the door in his face, but the server, accustomed to this type of situation, had been persistent. Now there was no turning back. The legal process was officially underway. Paula hired one of the most expensive law firms in Los Angeles, people who specialized in defending the rich and powerful. David was not intimidated. He told me that having expensive lawyers didn't mean they were right, that the evidence spoke for itself. Paula's lawyers presented a response to the lawsuit where they denied everything. They claimed the will was legitimate, that Helen had been in full possession of her faculties when she signed it, that the property transfers had been legal, and that I was an opportunist seeking to take advantage of my wife's death to take money from my son. Reading that response enraged me. How dare they say I was the opportunist? How dare they use Helen's memory that way? David calmed me down. He told me it was a normal legal strategy, that they always denied everything at first. He assured me that when we presented the medical evidence, the recordings, the testimonies of the doctors who treated Helen, their argument would collapse under its own weight. The first hearing was scheduled for a month later. David prepared me intensively for that day. He made me practice my statement. He taught me to answer difficult questions without getting upset, to maintain composure, even if Paula's lawyers tried to provoke me. He told me it was important for the judge to see me as a dignified victim, not as a bitter old man seeking revenge. On the day of the hearing, I put on the only suit I owned, an old one I used for special occasions. Mrs. Rose came to see me off early in the morning. She straightened my tie and gave me a big hug. She told me to go forward with the truth, that God protected the righteous. David picked me up at the hotel, and we went to the courthouse together. It was a big, old building downtown, full of people coming and going, lawyers with briefcases, families waiting in the hallways. We went up to the third floor, where the courtroom of the judge handling our case was located. Andrew and Paula were already there with their legal team. She was dressed elegantly as always. He was in a dark suit and looked like he hadn't slept in days. When they saw me enter, Paula shot me a look full of hatred. Andrew lowered his gaze. He couldn't meet my eyes. We entered the courtroom. It was a formal, serious space, with the judge's bench at the front and tables for the parties on each side. We sat down at our table, David next to me, his associates behind us. On the other side were Paula, Andrew, and their 3 lawyers. The judge entered, a man in his 50s with a serious expression, and we all stood up. The hearing began with the judge asking each party to present their opening arguments. David stood up and clearly laid out our case. He explained how Helen had been manipulated on her deathbed, how they had taken advantage of her vulnerable state to make her sign a will that contradicted her true intentions. He presented the original will as evidence. He pointed out the dates. He explained the chronology of events. Then he spoke about the fraudulent powers of attorney, how they had been used to transfer properties without my knowledge or consent. Finally, he mentioned the recordings where Paula admitted her plan to leave me with nothing. When David finished, Paula's lead lawyer stood up. He was an older man with white hair, possessing a deep, authoritative voice. He began by stating that this was a baseless lawsuit, motivated by the greed of a man who could not accept that his wife had decided to leave her estate to her son. He claimed Helen had been perfectly lucid when she signed the second will, that it had been her free and sovereign decision. He argued that the supposed irregularities in the property transfers were actually common legal strategies for estate planning, and regarding the recordings, he said they had been illegally obtained and taken out of context, proving nothing. I tensed up listening to him. He sounded convincing, professional. But David squeezed my arm, calming me. He whispered not to worry, that it was all smoke and mirrors. The judge listened to both parties without interruption. Then he asked us to present the documentary evidence. David began pulling out folders, handing certified documents to the judge. Helen's original will, certified by the public registry. The hospital medical records showing the medications Helen was receiving, including strong opioids that affected judgment. Sworn statements from the doctors who treated her, confirming that in her final weeks, she was not in a condition to make important decisions. Copies of the property transfers showing they had been made on consecutive days, all signed with the same shaky handwriting. The judge reviewed each document carefully, taking notes. Paula's lawyers also presented their evidence, including the second will they defended as legitimate, statements from the notary who had certified that will, and company papers showing the property transfers were duly recorded. Then came the time for testimony. The judge called me to the stand. I walked forward, feeling exposed, vulnerable. The judge asked me to swear to tell the truth. I swore. David approached and began to ask me questions. He asked me about my marriage to Helen. How many years had we been together? How had we built our assets? I told him our story from when we met until we started the company. He asked me about Helen's illness. What was that process like? My voice broke as I recalled. I had to drink water to continue. I told him about the treatments, the expenses, how Paula had started showing up with the lawyer, the papers they made us sign. David asked me if I had understood what I was signing. I told him not really, that I was emotionally devastated, that I trusted my daughter-in-law was helping. He asked me if Helen was in a condition to understand what she was signing. I told him definitely not, that there were days when she didn't recognize me, when she talked about things that made no sense. Then it was the turn of Paula's lawyer to cross-examine me. He stood up with a smile I didn't like. He started by asking me about my education. How many years had I gone to school? I told him I had only finished the 8th grade. He asked me if I knew how to read complex legal documents. I told him no. Very well. He asked me if I had consulted with my own lawyer before signing the powers of attorney. I told him no, that I didn't think it was necessary. I could see where he was going with this. He was trying to make me look like someone incapable of handling his own affairs. He asked me if it wasn't true that Helen had always handled the administrative side of the business because I didn't understand paperwork. I told him that was true, but that it didn't mean she would have wanted to leave me with nothing. He asked me how I could be so sure of Helen's intentions if, according to my own statement, she was confused in her final days. I told him because I knew her for over 40 years, because we had talked 1,000 times about what would happen when one of us was gone, because I knew she would never have left me unprotected. The lawyer insisted. He asked me if it wasn't true that Andrew had worked hard at the company, that he had earned his inheritance. I told him yes, that my son had worked, but that didn't justify dispossessing me of everything. He asked me how much money a man my age really needed to live if my social security wasn't enough. That question infuriated me. I replied that it wasn't about how much I needed, it was about justice, that my wife and I had built that estate together, that it was my right to receive what was due to me. The lawyer smiled as if he had achieved what he wanted, as if my anger proved something. David objected. He said the lawyer was harassing the witness. The judge agreed and asked Paula's lawyer to change his line of questioning. The lawyer continued, now asking me about my relationship with Andrew. He asked me if we were close. I told him we used to be, but that he had distanced himself in recent years. He asked me if I was resentful of that distance. I told him I was sad, but that I understood, that people change. He asked me if it wasn't true that I had never gotten along with Paula. I told him I tried to get along with her, but that she had always made me feel inferior. He asked me if I could give specific examples. I started telling him about the snubs, the derogatory comments about our house, about our neighborhood, about how we lived. The lawyer interrupted me and said those were just my perceptions, that they proved nothing. David objected again. He said the lawyer was arguing instead of asking. The judge sustained the objection. Finally, the cross-examination ended. I returned to my seat, feeling exhausted. David told me I had done well, that I had remained calm despite the provocations. Then it was the turn of other witnesses. David called one of the doctors who had treated Helen to the stand. The doctor, a young man with a professional look, confirmed under oath that Helen in her final weeks was under strong medication that affected her judgment. He said it was common practice in palliative medicine not to ask patients to make important decisions while they were on those medications. Paula's lawyers tried to discredit his testimony by asking if he had been present when Helen signed the will. The doctor said no, that he could only speak about her general condition during that period. Then David presented the recordings. The audio technician who had processed them testified about their authenticity. He confirmed that the voices belonged to Paula and the corrupt lawyer. The judge listened to the recordings in the courtroom. You could clearly hear Paula saying that I couldn't see a single dollar, that I was a nuisance, that they had to clean up the assets. When the playback finished, the silence in the room was absolute. I looked toward Paula's table. She was pale, her fists clenched. Andrew had his head in his hands, as if he couldn't bear to listen anymore. Her lawyers looked worried, whispering among themselves. The lead lawyer tried to argue that the recordings were taken out of context, that they were private conversations illegally obtained. David replied that they had been legally obtained by a licensed private investigator, that they did not violate any privacy laws because they were made in semi-public spaces, and that the context was clear. There was no way to misinterpret those words. The judge adjourned the session, saying he would review all the evidence presented and would convene a new hearing in 2 weeks to hear the closing arguments. We stood up when he left. David told me it had been a good day, that things had gone better than expected. As we left the courtroom, I saw Andrew standing in the hallway, alone. Paula had left with her lawyers. My son looked at me and took a step towards me. For a moment, I thought he was going to speak to me, to say something, but David put a hand on my shoulder and guided me toward the exit. He told me it wasn't a good idea to speak with the other party without lawyers present, that anything we said could be used against us. He was right, but a part of me wanted to hear what Andrew had to say. The next 2 weeks were agonizing. David returned to New York City for work, but he maintained constant contact, calling me every 2 days to check on me. I spent my days in the apartment, turning over everything that had happened in the hearing. Mrs. Rose came to visit me. She kept me company, distracting me with her stories and advice. She told me it was almost over, that justice would come soon, but I wasn't so sure. Paula's lawyers were good, professional. They knew how to create doubt. And even though the evidence seemed solid, you never know what a judge will decide. One night, I received another call from Andrew. This time, he sounded different, more resolute. He told me he had made a decision, that he was going to divorce Paula. He told me that after hearing the recordings in the hearing, after seeing all the evidence, he had confronted his wife. She had admitted that she had manipulated things, but that she had done it for their good, to protect their future, to ensure that I wouldn't squander the estate. Andrew told me he had asked her how she could think that of her own father-in-law, the man who had raised her husband. Paula had replied that I was a nuisance, that I represented a poor past they had overcome. Andrew told me that in that moment, he realized he had never really known the woman he had married, that he had been so blinded by her beauty and social class that he hadn't seen her true nature. I asked him why he was calling me to tell me this. He said he wanted me to know that he was going to cooperate with justice, that he was going to turn over all the documents he had in his possession, and that he would testify if necessary. He told me he knew this wouldn't fix what he had done, that it wouldn't compensate for the pain he had caused me, but that it was the least he could do. He also told me he understood if I could never forgive him, that he couldn't forgive himself. I asked him about the children, my grandsons. His voice cracked when he replied. He told me it was going to be difficult for them, that the divorce would affect them, but that he couldn't keep living a lie. I told him that the children were innocent in all this, that they didn't deserve to suffer for their parents' mistakes. Andrew agreed. He asked me if someday, when all this was over, he could see them again, if I would be willing to be a part of their lives. I didn't answer immediately. I told him we would have to see, that there was a lot of damage to heal first. David was happy when I told him about Andrew's call. He told me this greatly strengthened our case, that if Andrew was willing to testify against Paula, then we practically had the case won. He explained that in family fraud cases like this, the testimony of a directly involved family member carried a lot of weight. I asked him if he thought Andrew was being sincere, or if it was a legal strategy. David told me he couldn't be sure, but that from the way Andrew had looked at the hearing, from how he had reacted to the recordings, his regret seemed genuine. He warned me not to let my guard down, to continue with the case as if Andrew were still part of the opposing side, but to accept his cooperation if it came with real documents and testimony. Indeed, days later, David's lawyers received a package from Andrew's personal lawyer. It contained copies of emails between Paula and the corrupt lawyer, text messages discussing how to speed up property transfers before Helen died, internal company documents showing irregular money movements. It was a gold mine of evidence. David called me, excited. He told me that with this, there was no way Paula could escape. He also told me that the public prosecutor's investigation against Paula and the lawyer had advanced, that they had issued arrest warrants for both of them. Paula had been arrested the night before. She was in pre-trial detention while the criminal process unfolded. The corrupt lawyer had also been arrested. His firm had issued a statement saying it was a personal matter of the partner and that the firm had nothing to do with his actions. The news of Paula's arrest filled me with mixed feelings. On the one hand, I felt satisfaction that justice was acting, that she would pay for what she had done. On the other hand, I was sad thinking about my grandsons, how this would affect them. Andrew called me that same night. He sounded devastated. He told me he was the one who had turned over the additional evidence to the public prosecutor's office, that his lawyer had advised him to cooperate completely to show that he had not been consciously involved in the fraud. He told me his children had seen their mother being arrested, that they were confused and scared. I suggested he tell them the truth in an age-appropriate way, so they would understand that their mom had done bad things and had to face the consequences. But that didn't mean she didn't love them. The closing arguments hearing arrived faster than I expected. This time, the atmosphere in the courtroom was different. Paula was not there, obviously. She was still detained. Andrew was there, but now sitting in the back, as an observer, not as a defendant. His name had been removed from the lawsuit after David and his lawyers negotiated an agreement where Andrew agreed to return what had been fraudulently transferred in exchange for not facing criminal charges. David presented the closing arguments. He was methodical, precise. He reviewed every piece of evidence, every testimony, every document. He explained how everything fit together to prove a clear pattern of fraud and manipulation. He asked the judge to annul the second will, to reinstate Helen's original will, to order the return of all properties and money that had been fraudulently transferred, and to award me compensation and for moral damages. Paula's lawyer, now only defending her since Andrew had separated from the case, presented his closing arguments. But it was clear he was in a weak position. He could no longer deny the recordings. He could no longer say that everything had been legal when his own client was in prison accused of fraud. His strategy now was to minimize, to argue that Paula had acted believing she was doing what was best for the family, that there had been no criminal intent, only an error in judgment. He asked the judge for clemency. He argued that a woman of Paula's social position had already suffered enough with the arrest and public humiliation that losing all her assets would be excessive punishment. David stood up for the rebuttal and dismantled those arguments one by one. He said that the recordings clearly showed there had been intent, that Paula knew perfectly well what she was doing, that she had planned everything with coldness and calculation. He reminded the judge that this was not just a civil matter of money, it was a matter of human dignity, of an elderly man who had been stripped of everything he had worked for in his life by the greed of his own daughter-in-law. The judge listened to everything in silence, taking notes constantly. When both parties finished, he announced that he would give his verdict in 1 week. We stood up when he retired. As we left the courtroom, Andrew approached me. He asked me if we could talk for a few minutes. David looked at me, waiting for my decision. I told him yes, that it was fine. We moved away from the group of lawyers. Andrew and I, alone in a corner of the hallway. He looked finished. He had lost weight. He had deep, dark circles under his eyes. He told me that regardless of what the judge decided, he wanted me to know that he was truly sorry. He told me he had spent the last few weeks reviewing his life, thinking about everything he had lost by letting Paula lead him. He told me he missed his mother, that he felt guilty for not having been more present in her final days, for having left me alone to bear everything. I asked him why he had done it, why he had allowed things to go so far. Andrew was quiet for a moment, looking at the floor. Then he started talking in a low voice. He told me that when he met Paula, he felt lucky. She was everything he thought he wanted: beauty, class, contacts in circles he never could have accessed alone. He told me that little by little, she convinced him that to succeed, he had to leave his past behind, that successful people didn't cling to their humble origins but overcame them. He said Paula had made him feel ashamed of his own family, of the way Helen and I talked, of our simple clothes, of our neighborhood customs. He had started to believe her, to think that to belong to that new world, he had to cut ties with the old one. When Helen became ill, Paula told him it was the perfect opportunity to reorganize the family finances, to secure their future. She had convinced him that I was old, that I didn't need much to live out my final years, that it was only fair that he, as the only son and the one who really worked in the company, should receive the largest share. I asked him if he really believed all that. Andrew looked me in the eyes and said he wanted to believe it, because it was convenient for him, because it was easier than confronting Paula, than questioning the lifestyle they led. He told me he knew it was wrong, but he lied to himself. He told himself that he would help me later, that he wouldn't leave me destitute, that it was just a matter of time. But when the moment came, when I came to his house asking for help and Paula closed the door on me, he didn't have the courage to contradict her. He told me he stayed on the other side of the glass, listening to her humiliate me, and did nothing because he was a coward, because he was afraid of losing everything he had. I told him that was the problem, that he had valued material things more than his own family, that he had forgotten who he was and where he came from. Andrew nodded, tears in his eyes. He told me he understood now, that he had lost the most important thing, that money and social position meant nothing without the people you love. I asked him about the children, how they were handling everything. His face lit up a little when he spoke of them. He told me Sam and Matthew were confused, but that he was trying to be honest with them in a way they could understand. He had told them that their mum had made serious mistakes, that she had hurt their grandfather, and that was why she was facing consequences. He told me the children asked about me, that they remembered the few times they had seen me, and wanted to know why I no longer visited them. Andrew asked me if someday we could try to rebuild something, not necessarily the relationship we had before, but at least a relationship where he could learn to be a better father, and his children could know their grandfather. I didn't answer right away. I told him we would have to see, that there was a lot of pain to heal first. I told him that when all this was over, when we had the judge's verdict, and things calmed down, we could talk about that possibility. But I made it clear that if he ever betrayed me again, if he chose money over family again, then it would be the definitive end. The week waiting for the verdict was the longest of my life. Each day felt eternal. David called me to keep me calm. He told me everything pointed in our favor, but that in the judicial system, you could never be completely sure. I spent the nights sleepless, going over everything in my head, imagining different scenarios. I thought about Helen, how she would have reacted to all this. I liked to believe that she would be proud of me for fighting, for not letting myself be defeated. Mrs. Rose continued to be my constant. She brought me food, forced me to go for walks in the park so I wouldn't stay cooped up all day. She told me that no matter what happened, I had already won because I had recovered my dignity. I had shown that I wasn't a finished old man who could be trampled without consequences. Finally, the day of the verdict arrived. David had returned to Mexico specifically to be present. We went to the courthouse together, this time also accompanied by Mrs. Rose, who insisted on coming to support me. The courtroom was full. There were journalists who had found out about the case because of Paula's arrest. The scandal had been in some local news outlets. Andrew was also there, sitting alone on one of the back benches. Paula had been brought from the detention center. She entered handcuffed and escorted by 2 police officers. She looked very different from the elegant and arrogant woman I knew. She was wearing simple clothes, no makeup, her hair unkempt. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for her, but then I remembered her words in the recordings, her contempt for me, and the pity disappeared. The judge entered, and we all stood up. He sat down, arranged some papers in front of him, and began to speak. His voice was clear and firm. He started by summarizing the case, reviewing the arguments of both parties, the evidence presented. Then he proceeded to analyze each element of the lawsuit. First, he spoke about the will. He said that after reviewing all the medical evidence, the doctor's testimonies, and the circumstances under which the second will was signed, he had concluded that Helen Morales was not in full possession of her mental faculties when she signed it. This was due to the high doses of opioid analgesics she was receiving, medications that, according to medical literature, significantly affect judgment and decision-making capacity. Therefore, he declared the second will null and void and reinstated the validity of the original will signed 10 years earlier, when Helen was completely healthy. I felt my heart leap out of my chest. David squeezed my arm, a discreet smile on his face. The judge continued. He spoke about the powers of attorney that Paula had obtained. He said that while the documents were technically in order, the circumstances in which they were obtained constituted abuse and exploitation of vulnerable persons. He cited the emotional state I was in, the testimony of neighbors and acquaintances who confirmed that I was devastated and not in a condition to fully understand the implications of what I was signing. He declared those powers of attorney invalid, and consequently, all transactions and transfers that had been made under those powers invalid. He ordered that all properties that had been transferred to Andrew Morales's name be returned to the estate that belonged to me according to Helen's original will. The judge was not finished. He spoke about the audio recordings. He said that although this type of evidence could be questionable in some cases, in this particular case, the recordings clearly showed a pattern of fraudulent and premeditated conduct. Paula's words left no doubt about her intentions to dispossess me of my rights. The judge said verbatim that the evident contempt and cruelty in those recordings demonstrated that this had not been a simple error in judgment or a bad family decision, but a deliberate plan to appropriate the assets of a vulnerable family. Then he spoke about moral damages. He acknowledged that the harm caused to me was not only economic, but also emotional and psychological, that I had been a victim of familial abuse, that I had been humiliated and stripped of my dignity at the most vulnerable moment of my life after losing my wife. He ordered that I be compensated with an additional amount for these moral damages. Finally, the judge addressed the criminal matters, although those were being handled in a separate process by the public prosecutor's office. The judge said that this civil court strongly recommended that the full weight of the law be applied against Paula Morales and the notary who had participated in the fraud. He said that this type of abuse against vulnerable elderly people could not go unpunished, that it was the responsibility of the judicial system to protect the elderly from predators, even when those predators were members of their own family. When the judge finished reading his verdict, he struck the gavel and declared the session closed. The silence in the room broke with murmurs. Journalists started taking notes frantically. Some ran out to report the news. David hugged me, congratulating me. The other lawyers on his team shook my hand, patted me on the back. Mrs. Rose was crying with happiness. She hugged me tightly and told me we had done it, that Helen, from heaven, was smiling. I was in shock. I couldn't fully process what had just happened. I had won. After months of suffering, of humiliation, of feeling defeated, I had won. Not only had I recovered my estate, not only had I proven that I was right, but the judge had validated my pain, had publicly acknowledged that I had been a victim of terrible abuse. I looked toward where Paula was. She was pale, looking at the floor. Her lawyers were talking to her, but she seemed not to be listening. The police took her back to the exit, handcuffed, defeated. I searched for Andrew with my eyes. I found him still sitting on his bench, his face in his hands. I don't know if he was crying, but his shoulders were trembling. We left the courthouse surrounded by journalists. David had prepared a brief statement that he read in front of the cameras. He said this was a case of justice, that it demonstrated that the Mexican legal system worked when it came to protecting the most vulnerable. He said he hoped this case would serve as a precedent for other elderly people who were being abused by their own families, so they would know they could fight, that they were not alone. Reporters asked me questions. They wanted to know how I felt. I simply told them I felt relieved, that all I had sought was justice, not revenge, and that I was grateful the system had listened to me. David quickly pulled me away from the cameras. He said that was enough exposure for one day. We went to celebrate at a quiet restaurant near the courthouse. David, his team, Mrs. Rose, and me. They ordered wine. They toasted the victory. I didn't drink much, but that night I made an exception. I felt a mixture of emotions, joy for having won, but also sadness for everything I had had to go through to get there, for the family that had been destroyed in the process. David asked me what I was going to do now. I told him honestly I didn't know, that everything had happened so fast that I hadn't had time to think about the future. He explained that in the coming weeks, the property transfers back to my name would be processed, that the bank accounts that had been frozen would be unlocked, and that I would also receive the compensation for moral damages that the judge had ordered. He told me that economically I would be fine, better than I had been in years. But he warned me that now came the difficult part, deciding what to do with my life, how to rebuild after all this. That night, back in my apartment, I sat in the living room looking at the old photos of Helen I had on a shelf. I spoke to her as if she could hear me. I told her we had won, that her memory had been vindicated, that the will she truly wanted had been reinstated. I asked for her forgiveness for taking so long to realize the betrayal, for not having better protected her legacy. I promised her that I would use the estate we had worked so hard to build wisely, that I wouldn't let it be wasted. And I promised her that, even though it hurt, I would try to keep a door open for Andrew and the children, because I knew she would have wanted the family to somehow stay together. The following days were filled with bureaucratic procedures. David and his lawyers accompanied me to sign documents, to register the properties back in my name, to open new bank accounts. It was surreal to see those amounts of money, those deeds with my name on them. After months of living on the bare minimum, of worrying about every dollar, suddenly I had more than enough to live comfortably for the rest of my days. But money couldn't bring back Helen, couldn't erase the months of suffering, couldn't fully repair the relationship with my son. David helped me hire a trustworthy CPA to manage my finances. He explained that I should be careful, that I shouldn't make hasty decisions, that I should take time to decide what to do with everything. One afternoon, approximately 2 weeks after the verdict, Andrew showed up at my apartment. He knocked on the door softly. When I opened it and saw him standing there with a bouquet of flowers and a nervous look, I didn't know what to say. He asked if he could come in. I told him yes. We went into the living room. He sat down on the sofa where he had played so many times as a child. He put the flowers on the table. They were carnations, Helen's favorite flowers. He told me he had come to talk without lawyers, without intermediaries, just him and me. He told me the divorce process with Paula was underway. She would probably face several years in prison for the fraud. Her defense lawyer was trying to negotiate a reduced sentence in exchange for returning what she could of the money. He told me he had sold the Bel Air mansion, that it was too big and full of bad memories. He had moved with the children to a more modest apartment. He was learning to live more simply. I asked him how Sam and Matthew were doing. He told me they were adjusting, that it was hard for them to understand why their mum wasn't there, but that they were slowly accepting the new reality. He told me he had started therapy with them, that a child psychologist was helping them process everything. Then he looked at me directly and told me he wanted to ask me something important. He asked me if I would be willing to meet the children again, to be a part of their lives. He told me they needed positive figures. They needed to know their roots, to know where they came from. He said he had told them about me, how I had built the company from scratch with Helen, how I had given him everything so he would have opportunities. He had shown them old photos from when he was a child, of the construction sites, of the simple but happy times. I didn't answer immediately. I took my time to think. I looked at the photos of Helen on the shelf, as if seeking her advice. Finally, I told Andrew yes, that I was willing to meet my grandsons, to try to build a relationship with them. But I set clear conditions. I told him that if I was going to do this, it had to be with complete honesty, that the children had to know the truth about what had happened, adapted to their age but without lies. I told him I wouldn't pretend that everything was perfect, that our relationship was damaged and that it would take time, maybe years, to rebuild some trust. I told him I would be a part of my grandsons' lives, but that didn't mean he and I would go back to being what we were before. Andrew accepted all my conditions. He told me he understood, that he didn't expect miracles, that he was just grateful for the opportunity. We agreed that the following week he would bring the children to visit me. Andrew left, and I stayed there thinking about what I had just agreed to. It was a big step, opening my heart again after so much pain. But I thought about Helen, how she adored those children, and I knew it was the right thing to do. The days before the visit, I spent preparing. I cleaned the apartment thoroughly. I bought toys appropriate for their ages. I prepared snacks I thought they would like. Mrs. Rose helped me. She told me I looked more excited than she had seen me in a long time. She was right. I was nervous, but also excited to truly get to know my grandsons, to be the grandfather I hadn't been able to be for the last few years. The day arrived. Andrew showed up with Sam and Matthew. Sam was 8 years old, Matthew 6. They were beautiful children, with features that reminded me of Helen and also of Andrew when he was little. They entered shyly, looking at everything with curiosity. I told them to come in, that this was their grandfather's house. Sam asked me directly if I was the grandfather their dad had told them about, the one who had built houses and buildings. I told him yes, That was what I had done all my life. Matthew, younger and more innocent, asked me if I was good or bad, because his mum had done bad things, and he was confused. The question completely disarmed me. I knelt down to be at his height and told him that I was his grandfather, that I loved them very much, even though I hadn't seen them often, and that I would always try to do the right thing. We spent the afternoon together. I showed them old photos of when Andrew was a child, photos of Helen, of the company in its beginnings. I told them stories of how their dad helped me on the job sites on weekends, of how their grandma Helen cooked for all the workers. The children listened, fascinated. They asked questions. They laughed at the anecdotes. At one point, Matthew climbed onto my lap and hugged me. He said I smelled like he imagined a grandfather should smell. I felt my eyes well up with tears, but I held them back. I didn't want to scare the children. Andrew watched us from a corner, with a mixed expression of sadness and hope. When it was time to leave, the children asked me to visit them again soon, that they wanted to hear more stories. I promised them yes. Over time, the children became more comfortable. They trusted me. They told me about their school, their friends, their fears and unease, and their dreams. I talked to them about values, about the importance of honest work, of respect for others. I tried to be the figure Helen would have wanted me to be for them. With Andrew, the relationship remained complicated. There were good days and bad days. Sometimes we managed to talk normally. Other times, the silence between us was heavy, loaded with everything that had happened. But we both made the effort for the children, and slowly, very slowly, something began to heal. Meanwhile, I had made important decisions about my future. After much thought, I decided I didn't want to stay in Los Angeles. There were too many painful memories, too many open wounds. With the recovered money and the properties sold, I had more than enough to start anew. I looked for options and found a small but beautiful house in a quiet town near San Diego. A place with good weather, kind people, peace. I bought it and started making plans to move. I wasn't making a definitive retirement. I still came to the city regularly to see the grandsons, but I needed a place that was mine, where I could build new memories without the weight of the past. I also made decisions about the company. I no longer had the age or energy to manage it personally. I hired a trustworthy professional administrator, someone recommended by David, to run it. Andrew no longer worked there. He had been removed from his position after the scandal, but the long-time employees, the ones who had worked with me since the beginning, were still there. I made sure their jobs were protected, that they had good working conditions. It was my way of honoring the legacy Helen and I had built, ensuring that the company would continue to be a place where people could earn a decent living. As for Paula, she received her final sentence a few months later. The judge in the criminal case sentenced her to 5 years in prison for fraud, plus the complete return of what she had stolen and a considerable fine. The corrupt lawyer received a similar sentence and was permanently disbarred from practicing his profession. Newspapers covered the case as an example of justice for seniors, victims of family abuse. I didn't feel particular satisfaction upon hearing the sentence, just a sense of closure, that everything was finally over. Paula tried to write me a letter from prison, asking for my forgiveness and that I intercede to have her sentence reduced. I didn't reply. There were things that couldn't be forgiven with a simple letter. The damage was too deep. David became more than my lawyer. He became my close friend, the family I had lost. We remained in constant contact. He came to visit me at my new house in the town when he could. He told me about his life in New York City, about the cases he was handling. I told him about my new quiet routine, the afternoons in the garden, the kind neighbors, the visits from the grandsons. He told me I looked better, more relaxed, that I had recovered some of the peace I had lost. He was right. For the first time in years, I felt in control of my life, making my own decisions, living on my own terms. My house in the town became my refuge. It was small, only 2 bedrooms, but it had a beautiful garden where I planted tomatoes, peppers, herbs. It reminded me of my parents' house when I was a child. The neighbours were simple, hard-working people. They accepted me without asking much about my past. They knew me as Mr. Robert, the quiet gentleman who lived in the house on the corner, and sometimes received visits from his grandsons. I started getting involved in the community. I helped with local projects. I went to the town festivals. It wasn't the life I had imagined when Helen and I built our estate, but it was a good life, quiet, honest. The grandsons continued to visit me regularly. Andrew drove every 2 weeks from the city to bring them. Sometimes they stayed the whole weekend. They slept in the guest room. They helped me in the garden. They played with the neighborhood children. Sam told me he liked coming because everything was quieter here than in the city, that he could think better. Matthew said he liked it because I taught him things his dad didn't know, like planting vegetables or fixing things with his hands. I was passing on what my father had passed on to me, the value of manual labor, the satisfaction of creating something with your own hands. Andrew and I had reached a tacit understanding. We didn't talk about the past unless necessary. We focused on the present and on giving the children stability. Trust was slowly being rebuilt, like a plant that grows little by little. There was still pain. There were still awkward moments. But there was also a willingness from both sides to keep trying. One afternoon, almost a year after the verdict, I was sitting in my garden, watching the sunset, when I received a call from Andrew. He told me he needed to talk to me about something important. He came the next day, alone, without the children. He sat down with me in the garden and began to speak. He told me he had been in therapy all this time, working to understand why he had made the decisions he did, why he had let Paula manipulate him. He told me his therapist had helped him see that he had always been afraid of not being enough, of not measuring up to what Helen and I had achieved. When he met Paula and she offered him a different world, a shortcut to acceptance and success, he took it without thinking about the consequences. He asked for my forgiveness again, but this time in a deeper, more sincere way. He apologized not only for what he had done, but for the person he had become, for having betrayed the values we had raised him with. I listened without interrupting. When he finished speaking, I remained silent for a moment, thinking about what to say. Finally, I told him I forgave him, not because what he had done wasn't serious, but because I had carried enough resentment and it was making me tired. I told him that forgiveness didn't mean forgetting, that the scars would remain, but that I was willing to move forward. I told him he had shown me with his actions over the last year that he was truly trying to change, to be a better father, a better person. I told him Helen would have wanted us to find a way to coexist, to be family again, even if it was in a different way than before. Andrew cried, a liberating cry, and for the first time in years, I hugged him as I had hugged my son when he was a child. Now, sitting here in my garden at 66 years old, looking at the mountains in the distance, I can say that my life didn't end as I planned, but it didn't end in defeat either. I lost Helen, the woman of my life, and that loss will never completely heal. I faced the greatest betrayal a father can face, that of his own son. I had to fight for my dignity when it would have been easier to give up, but I also gained important things. I recovered my estate, and with it my financial security, for my final years. I recovered my dignity. I proved to myself and to the world that I wasn't a finished old man, but someone with courage and strength. I recovered, albeit imperfectly, a relationship with my son, and I gained the opportunity to be a real grandfather to Sam and Matthew. I learned that family is not always what you think, that blood ties can be broken, but they can also be mended if there is willingness. I learned that it is never too late to fight for what is just, that age is no excuse for letting yourself be trampled. I learned that revenge does not bring peace, but justice does, that there is an important difference between the two. And I learned, above all, that you can start over at any age, that as long as there is life, there is an opportunity to write new chapters. David remains a fundamental part of my life, the son I chose, more than the one I got by blood. Mrs. Rose comes to visit me in the town sometimes. She says she likes the fresh air and my company. Andrew and I have a relationship that is not perfect, but it is honest, built on new and more solid foundations than the old ones. The grandsons give me joy and purpose. They remind me why it is worth continuing. And Helen, although no longer physically present, is still there in every decision I make, in every value I try to pass on, in every moment where I choose the right path over the easy one. This modest house in this quiet town is now my home. It is not the mansion Andrew and Paula had. It is not the multi-million-dollar company we built. But it is mine, bought with justice, inhabited with peace. Here I can rest, knowing that I did the right thing, that I honored Helen's memory, that I left a legacy of dignity for my grandsons. Here, between the mountains and the open sky, I found what I had lost in the midst of betrayal and pain: my peace, my dignity, and the certainty that in the end, truth and justice prevail. And with that, at 66 years old, I can say that I am ready for whatever comes next, to enjoy these remaining years knowing that I did not give up, that I fought until the end, and that I won not only in the courts, but in recovering my soul.